A few weeks ago, we started into this series on Ecclesiastes. And one of the things that's so interesting about a study through the book of Ecclesiastes is that it is a study of the meaning of life. And the way the writer here, presumably Solomon, wrote it, when he wrote it, the idea was, what's the meaning of life? He's looking from an older man's perspective into the crowd of the congregation, as you will, and saying, here are things that I've learned along the way about life. Here's what I've learned about the meaning of life. And I would say that as we look into chapter 3, tonight, over the next 15 minutes, believe it or not, just going to do an overview, a flyover of Ecclesiastes 3. And tomorrow, I'm going to put onto camera the entire sermon. And so if you're following along and you're really wanting to dive into the depths of Ecclesiastes 3, and maybe you're just going to catch a couple things tonight, that's okay. Tomorrow on our YouTube channel, the rest of the sermon will be there. So what's the point? Where's Solomon going here in Ecclesiastes 3? Where he's going, I would say that Ecclesiastes 3 might be among the most powerful and insightful chapters of all of the Old Testament. And I've entitled the sermon tonight, Bound. I need to make sure that I get this right because I was playing around with the wordplay. Bound by time, beauty for eternity. Bound by time, beauty for eternity. All of us feel the constraints of time. Boys and girls in this room, do you remember your birthday? Do you know when your birthday is? Boys and girls, do you know? Do you know? All at once, I want to invite you, boys and girls, to share with me and the rest of us in the room, when is your birthday? Ready? 1, 2, 3. See, I know that if I guess, I have a 1 in 366 shot odds of getting it right, that's your birthday, right? But here's the thing. The writer here in Ecclesiastes 3 says that all of us had a time that we were born. You know your birthday. Now, some of you might not know exactly where you were born, but your parents do. And you might look on into Ecclesiastes 3, and he starts with a poem, and he has 28 different statements in this poem about life, and specifically about time. And I've been thinking very philosophically this week, which is this big word about trying to think in depth of it. Did God create time? Well, the obvious answer is yes. But to the human thinking in person here that just uses logic, it says, well, time has already been. Yet Jesus was before time. Why did God give us time? So let's look outside. Right now, is it daytime or nighttime? Daytime, isn't it? God reminds us that he's the one that brings up the sun, and throughout the day, we can see what's going on in the world. But at night, he reminds us when the sun goes down that even though we don't want to, it's time to sleep, isn't it, right? And so bedtime should be important within our lives. At least I think it should be, especially for my own children. I would love for that to be a stable thing of life. God also reminds us that in time he has seasons. Can anyone name the 4 seasons? We have summer. What's after summer? Fall. And after fall? Winter. And then after winter? We have spring. That's right. God has given us seasons to remind us that there is a timetable that he has put into order on a rhythm that is outside of our control. The writer of Ecclesiastes, the preacher, is saying God has given us time, and if we're really honest, time is filled with all sorts of seasons that have their highs and have their lows. And one of the trickiest things about life is to realize and identify what season you're in at this time. And I don't mean summer, I mean what season of life you're in. You might be in a season right now where it's like life is really, really hard, and there's all sorts of frustrations that are a part of life. You might be in a season right now where you're like, I'm on top of the world. You know, like that scene from Titanic, that could be one of those things that at this moment you're like, hey, this is a great moment. But oftentimes, one of the things that's frustrating about life is when we figure out what season we're in, the next season starts before we're ready for it to start. And identifying what season we're in, the writer is saying, is really important. But there's a word that comes up over and over and over again in Ecclesiastes, and the idea behind it is this Hebrew word called Hevel, Hevel. And Hevel is life is like a vapor, like a mist. It's here one day and it's gone the next. And within that vapor of life, life has all sorts of frustrations. And the more that we want to control life around us, the more frustrated we are, because the reality is we can't control time. God alone controls time. But then he goes on in these verses, if you have a Bible, verses 9 through 15, and they're going to be up on the screen, and you can follow along with them or open your Bible and follow along. And here are those verses. What gain has the worker from his toil? I have seen the business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. He has made everything beautiful in its time. Also, he has placed eternity into man's heart, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from beginning to end. We'll come back to that verse in a second. And then he goes on, he says, I perceive that there is nothing better for them than to be joyful and to do good as long as they live. Also that everyone should eat and drink and take pleasure in all his toil. This is God's gift to man. Did you catch that? All of the work, all the frustrations of life, all of the vapor-like nature of life, we're supposed to find a way to find enjoyment and pleasure in it. Now, most guys in this room and most women in this room who are in a job, regardless of what that job is, you're like, tomorrow's Monday, and I got to get up and go to work. Or some of you are like, hey, this quarantine and pandemic has affected my job. I wish that I could go to work tomorrow. Regardless of where you are, life is short, life is fleeting, and the writer is saying, whatever season you're in, try to find pleasure in contentment in that season. Then he goes on and he says, I perceive that whatever God does endures forever. Nothing can be added to it, nor anything taken from it. God has done it so that people fear before him that which is already has been, that which is to be, already has been, and God seeks what has been driven away. Such poetic meaning of life, big picture stuff. Now remember what I said, if you watch the very first message on Ecclesiastes, depending on what age group you're in, it's going to hit you in a different way. To those of us who are over 40 years old, we're like, truth, preach it. To those of you who are like 60 plus years old, and several of those were a part of the earlier service that we had tonight, they were like, oh yes, this is exactly what life is. But to some of you who are like children or feel like you're children, you're like, I don't know why we're talking about the meaning of life. All I know is that I'm hungry for a hamburger. All that I know that is I want what I want when I want it. Why don't I have it when I want it? Because I want it on my timeline. That's what kind of goes through our minds. But what I want to focus on just for a couple minutes is verse 11. Verse 11 is the theme of chapter 3. Verse 11 says that God has made everything beautiful in his time. Did you see that? God is the one who makes things beautiful, and God's the one that makes beautiful things in his time. But if that's true, then our fight against time and wanting to make things beautiful on our timetable means that we are trying to be God. We are trying to make things beautiful in our ways, how we define beautiful, and within our own power and on our own timeline. And the more that we try to grab hold and control that, the more frustrated we will be, the more frustrated life will be. But then he goes on and he says this second part that I heard and read through this verse years and years and years ago, and this verse has never left me. Deep within all of us, men, women, and children in this room and watching later, all of us can really understand this. God has placed something within us. The writer here says eternity. God has placed within us, and he wants us to long for something that's beyond the sun. Long for something that we can't see. See, we try to fill the void of life with the things of life, the things under the sun. So if life doesn't have meaning or purpose, then it must mean that I need to go on Amazon and buy something new. And then we get that something new, we're like, this isn't so great. I mean, right before this pandemic hit, I had to replace my car. That was nice until I had to start making the car payments. Then it wasn't so nice anymore, just being honest, right? And it still has a new car smell, but it's not exactly the same. That car is going to be old sooner than later. I can try to replace it with something that's material. I can try to replace it with something that's relational. I can be like, oh, when the perfect guy comes along or the perfect girl comes along, life is going to have so much more fulfillment. And the reality is that that's not true. It's temporary, and then guess what? Life starts to feel a little bit of Hevel. And then you're like, hey, well, I think it'd be better if I had more education or a job, or I had a house that was my own, or I had all of these other things that were my own, and life would all of a sudden be better. Because we want to control things on our table because there's a longing within us to make things beautiful, and yet we want that beautiful thing in our own timeline. But God's the one that makes it beautiful in his timeline. God has put in each of us a desire for the life to come, where all the things of this world, all of the pain, the sorrow, the sickness, and even death will be no more. And in that longing, it's a desire that God has made within us, a God-like hunger for God himself, for us to be in communion with God, for us to grow in relationship with God. So I want to leave you with these 3 quick things. How do we just take from this overview, how should we live today? A great place to start is with 3 words. Journey. Journey is the first word. Feel life's boundaries. Feel the pain and the frustrations of life's boundaries. You might say, well, I'm a teenager today, but before you know it, you're going to be an old person. It's just true. I can't tell you how many people I've talked to who are older, well on in years, who have said, man, life just seems like it blinked before my eyes. I remember when my first child was born. Now I remember that child is now a parent of their own. How did that happen? Feel life's boundaries and find contentment in its seasons. Try to identify what season you're in right now. All of us have been forced to be in some sort of a pandemic season, and we all went into it kind of kicking and screaming. And yet, God did some things that were really special during this season. You know what he's done? I see on my street, kids are playing outside more than they ever did before. Families are doing things together more than they ever did before. Even at this moment, a pandemic is forcing us to have family worship together, even though it's great what happens in children's ministry. When those doors open again, we will celebrate. But until then, look, as parents, we had an opportunity to model to children, and you as adults who aren't parents of kids in this room, you get to model to other children what it's like to worship the one and only living God. That's something to celebrate. There's been good things, but there's also been difficult things. Instead of like looking for tomorrow and saying life will be better if or when, it'd be better for us to look at today and say God has brought about all sorts of frustrations, even in my life, even within this morning and afternoon, that if I'm honest, the height of frustration. And yet, I'm reminding myself through this study to say, hey, what good is God doing at this moment of the journey? But then move beyond the journey to observe. Observe life's discontentments within you and your frustrations in trying to change those discontentments. What are the things in life right now that you're like, it just doesn't seem right? Everything just seems to be wrong, and I just longing for the day that I get on the golf course. This is me, and it's a par 5, feeling like 800 yards, which doesn't exist, okay? And I want to hit the ball straight, right in the fairway, and then the fairway again, and then on, and it's a par 5, and then birdie in or par in. That means that I get it in 5 shots. It happened once yesterday, right, Mark? Just one. No, for me. No, that was me. Okay, that was right. That was you. But it did happen. It happened once. But I want every hole of the 18 to be a hole that it goes straight every time. And I'm discontented, so I look down and say, like, I just need to practice more. No, I need to just change out the irons. No, I just need to find my own place that I can go and play all the time that I want to, or whatever that is. Life has all sorts of silly discontentments, but it also has meaningful discontentments. It's like, what is in a life that if I bought it today would make life worth living tomorrow? Virtually nothing. There's nothing that life can offer under the sun, the writer is saying, that is going to last forever, that has fulfillment. So observe how God is working, observe your discontentments, and hold on to the fact that God is with you in the journey and in the process of life. And then finally, yearn. Yearn. This is this old-time word that I love its meaning because as a soul and gut level, yearn for eternity. I was going to say learn to yearn for eternity. Yearn for what is to come because God is working now, even when we don't see it, even when we don't feel it, he's still working. God give us eyes to see that. And then know that as we long for eternity, if we set our mind and hope on the Creator, there is all the difference that God will do in us. I want to just put these 2 verses on the screen, and then we're going to sing a song. Look at these verses. If then you have been raised with Christ, seek the things that are above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on things that are above, not on things that are on earth. Even in the Bible, Jesus himself says, hey, store up treasures in heaven. Paul comes along later and says, if you're a Christian, set your mind above. Set your eyes fixed on Jesus, the one who reigns and the one who rules. See, God has given in us a desire for us to be a part of something bigger than ourselves. And we can see that in the sports arena. We can see that play out in the other arenas of life with the protests that are going on, the riots that are going on, with the politics that are going on, with the pandemic that's going on. Even in a global scale, people have all sorts of opinion, and the enemy comes in to steal, kill, and divide. He wants to destroy us. And yet, when we have eyes to see what God has said in his word, there is something that is redemptive that happens. What I have found is, and this is just free food for thought. What I have found is, over the last couple weeks, is to look into the benedictions of the Bible. 1 Thessalonians 5. The end of the letters that Paul wrote, for example, or in Peter, there's benedictions that are there. God calls us through the pens of these men how to live. So turn off the TV and the news, turn off the social media, open up the Bible into the benedictions, and there's a grounded nature that comes and say, oh, this is how I'm supposed to live. God has wanted me to be a part of something bigger, but that something bigger is good and well and fine to fight for in this life, so long as my eyes are fixed on the one who rules and reigns, and he is the one who has brought us back together into his family. We are the church, and we are his people. May our minds and our eyes be fixed on him.